Hey Calvary kids, good to see you again this week, and we're back and we are still in the Old Testament, but we're really only in the Old Testament for another month, and then we get to the New Testament. But last week we talked about Zechariah and how God sent 8 visions to Zechariah, and they were pretty strange visions if we're honest, but the ultimate message of those visions is that someday the Messiah is going to come and bring salvation to God's people, but judgment on God's enemies. And he also predicted a king who would come and not only would be a king, but would also act like a priest. And we talked about how that person ultimately is Jesus, who both is a king, but also went to God on our behalf to fix our relationship and forgive our sins. But today, we're going to learn about a woman named Esther. And as you may have guessed, the best place to read about Esther is indeed the book of Esther. So pause as a family and find the book of Esther. So historically, if you remember, that King Cyrus is the one who had ultimately sent the Jews home to rebuild the temple and go back to their homeland. And then remember, we had King Darius, who's the one that governor sent the message to double check if they were allowed to build the temple. Well, now we have another new king after King Darius, and his name was King Ahasuerus. Now, that is kind of a mouthful, and you probably have also heard him called King Xerxes. So for the sake of not having a tongue twister, we're going to call him King Xerxes. And he was the king of Persia. And you might be wondering, well, why are we still worried about Persia if the Jews have gone back home? Well, you see, some of the Jews went back home, but some of the Jews chose to remain in Persia. They had settled there, they had become comfortable there living among the Persians. And you also may have noticed we're starting to call them Jews, not Israelites. And that's because eventually, since they were from Judah, they became known as Jews instead of Israelites. So pretty much from here, even into the New Testament, God's people are going to be called Jews, not Israelites. And so we meet this woman named Esther, and she's living with her uncle Mordecai, and she's just kind of minding her own business when one day something crazy happens. She ultimately becomes chosen by Xerxes to become the queen of Persia, this huge empire. But there was something that Esther kept secret from the king, even once she was made queen. So pause and as a family read Esther 2:20 to see what it was she kept secret. In Esther 2:20, try to find out what Esther kept secret from the king. So the thing that Esther chose to not reveal to the king was the fact that she was a Jew. To do so could have put her in danger or could have lowered her position as queen or things like that. And so she was a little concerned about how the king would react if she revealed that she was a Jew. And so we also meet this other character. So we have King Xerxes, we have Esther, we have Mordecai, and then we have another character named Haman. And Haman was one of the king's advisors. And he came up with a plan to kill all of the Jews, all of God's people. And you're like, wow, that got really serious really fast. And you might be wondering, well, why did he decide to come up with this plan? And I bet you all can figure it out. So pause and read Esther 3:5-6 to find out why did Haman decide to kill all of the Jews, all of God's people, in Esther 3:5-6. So we see Haman came up with this awful plan just because one guy, Mordecai, refused to bow down to him. This plan said basically that anyone could attack the Jews and take their stuff on one particular day. Well, of course, as you can imagine, Mordecai and the Jews were extremely upset by this, as you would be too if an order came that people were allowed to just attack you. So Mordecai turns to Esther for help because, she's the queen, right? But here's the thing. No one, even the queen, can go appear before the king if he doesn't ask to see you. You're not just allowed to walk in and say, "What's up, king?" That doesn't happen. And if you showed up without the king calling you, you could be killed. Unless the king raises his scepter, like the fancy golden stick thing, essentially. If he raises that, you're good. But if he doesn't, you could be killed. So Esther is, of course, frightened to go before the king without being called. But what does Mordecai say to Esther? And to read what Mordecai says, it's really cool. Read Esther 4:13 through 14. What does Mordecai say to Esther in Esther 4:13 through 14? So Mordecai essentially says to Esther, hey, you have this great opportunity to help out God's people, to help out your people. And if you don't, God's going to provide for us from somewhere else. But God is giving you this chance to be a part of his plan. Perhaps you were put here for this very purpose. And so Esther asks Mordecai and the Jews to fast for 3 days. And she decides to go to the king, even though she might be killed. But when she went, not only did the king raise his scepter, saying that she was allowed to talk to him and wouldn't be killed, but he also even offered her up to half the kingdom. So we see that Xerxes likes Esther and is willing to hear what she has to say. So what she does is she invites the king and Haman, remember the guy who came up with this awful idea to kill all the Jews, she invites the two of them to a feast. And so they come to the feast. It's Esther, Haman, and King Xerxes. And once again, the king offers up to half the kingdom, and Esther says something to the king that's like the ultimate plot twist. So read Esther 7:3 through 6 to see what did Esther say to the king. So Esther reveals to the king that she's a Jew and that Haman had come up with the idea to kill all of the Jews, which would include her. And this makes King Xerxes very upset because, like I said, he really likes Esther. And so he ends up killing Haman and making a law that says that people can't attack the Jews, and God delivers the Jews from their enemies through this. So my question is, does this story remind you of another story in some ways? In fact, in many ways, if you think about it, Esther reflects qualities that Jesus had in what he did. So pause and as a family, discuss some ways that Esther reminds us of Jesus. So just some ways Esther's similar to Jesus. She's willing to sacrifice herself for God's people. She was queen at just the right time in order to save God's people. Similarly, Jesus came at just the right time, and while Esther didn't have to die, Jesus did die for his people to save them. And not only did he die to save Jewish people, he also came to save people who weren't Jewish. And similarly, Haman thought he had won, right? This evil guy who planned to kill God's people. And similarly, Satan thought that he had won when Jesus died on the cross. But we know that he didn't win at all, and that Jesus proved his victory over Satan, sin, and death when he rose again from the grave. So what does this have to do with us? And so, as I've told you the story of Esther, I've been mentioning what God did through the story of Esther. But interestingly enough, in the whole book of Esther, God's name isn't mentioned. But when we read the book of Esther, we see God working through different situations that only God could have arranged. None of these things happened by accident or were just coincidences. All of these things were arranged by God so that his people could be saved, even if he's not named within the book. So sometimes we might feel like God doesn't care about us, he seems far away, or we don't understand his plan. But God never abandons his people, even when sometimes it's hard for us to see how he's at work. God always has a plan. And what's amazing is that he calls us to be a part of it, whether we're adults, teenagers, and even kids. So pause as a family and discuss how you can be a part of God's plan and what he's doing. So we don't know the specifics of God's plan, but we do know that God commands us to love him and love others and to share the good news about him with others. So how can you use your talents and your skills to do those things? Maybe it's writing letters and drawing pictures to people who are lonely and hurting. Maybe it's serving your family by helping with extra chores. Maybe it's simply being an encouragement to your siblings or your parents. So my challenge this week is to think of one person, and then this week think of one way you can point that person to Jesus. Like I said, maybe it's an encouraging word, maybe you share the gospel with them, or maybe it's sending them a kind note or picture. But think of one person and then think of a way how you can point them to Jesus. You don't have to wait to be an adult to be a part of God's plan. You can be a part of it right now. And who knows, perhaps God has put you where you are for such a time as this. I'll see you next week, Calvary kids. Bye.